your introduction. Okay, thank you for the recording too. Bon dia, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here today in a real place with real people in a real room. I'll be talking about in the next tens of minutes or so about some of the research that I did with the field of CO2 conversion to chemicals. And to motivate this talk, I thought of using this picture. This picture does not contain any complicated graphs about amounts of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere or climate change, but I think this conveys very well the challenges we face. The challenge of climate change and the challenge of global warming, a challenge that we are fighting. A lot of people in this room across the camera on the other side of the camera, to many groups in the world are working to revert this trend in climate change. And one of the reasons that this happened is because we like to consume a lot of energy. So to grow our society, we do so to advance, and we do so just to live. Just to give you a ballpark number of what this 18 terawatt year energy amount means, this would be the equivalent of every person in the world having 7,000 iPhones that are charged every single day around the globe. I don't think you can see the end of the screen, but that's fine. And one of the problems is that we get most of this energy from fossil fuels. You could see in this plot a cube diagram of the proven reserves of different energy sources around the globe. So you could see this big black cube of coal. You could see also oil. You could see natural gas. You could see uranium. And you could see in this smaller cube in red the world yearly energy consumption, this 18 terawatt year number that you have seen in the previous slide. On the other hand, you could see this much bigger cube comprising the solar energy that Earth captures every year at the ground level. One good news is that we are transitioning slowly from these fossil finite fuels, these sources, into these solar or these more broadly renewable sources. Over the last decade, the cost of solar has declined so much that it has reached grid parity in many jurisdictions. That means using solar is now cheap. You could see, for example, here the cost over the years. I remember when I started my PhD in photovoltaics, that the cost was so high that it was a dream to think like at some point solar would be so cheap. Now the dream is kind of true, and even in some big solar farms in Abu Dhabi, really cheap electricity has been achieved using solar. Now, one of the problems of solar energy, and in general a problem of renewables, is that this electricity has to be stored, has to be delivered, because these sources are intermittent and the demand is also intermittent. So you need to deploy this energy to the place where it needs to be used. You could see in this plot another interesting graph where you could see how electricity and how carbon dioxide emissions are distributed across different sectors. You could see in this bottom area of the graph how these different sectors, such as industrial, residential, and commercial, have been already electrified. Okay, so in principle, these areas could already use renewable electricity directly. On the other hand, there are other sectors, such as transportation or industry itself, where we still need a lot of materials, a lot of fuels, a lot of chemicals that cannot be directly achieved using renewables so far. For example, to make fuels for engines, for jets, and for cars that still have higher energy density and high power density than batteries. So at some point, even though some of these will be displaced by batteries, we will still need fuels for that. Interestingly, we still need a lot of chemicals to build the clothes we wear, to build materials, to build plastics, materials for construction. A lot of things still rely on fossil fuels and petrochemicals. So it would be nice if we could think of ways of using renewable electricity, if possible, to decarbonize this sector. One way of doing so is to work in some kind of renewable carbon cycle. For example, using renewable electricity, like here, like wine or solar, and using water, which is intermittent, as we said before, the electricity is intermittent, together with carbon dioxide captured from the atmosphere or from point sources such as industries, and altogether using some kind of process such as this one here, photoelectrochemistry, to create the chemical feedstock that we need to create fuels that could be utilized in a circular fashion. So enabling the development of circular economies and overall sustainable development. This technology, which I'm sure in this institute you are very familiar with, is based on water electrolysis. Water electrolysis consists on two coupled reactions. So you have a half reaction where water is oxidized into oxygen, and you have another half reaction where water or ions in the electrolyzer are converted into hydrogen. There is ion motion from one side to the other, and there is electron motion to close the circuit. In this kind of system, you need to fabricate, you need to design catalysts that reduce the energy required to drive these two reactions. So to lower the energy input here, the solar cell that you plug into these electrolyzers if you wish to run them using solar. So in order to use this less energy, you have to design some catalysts that improve the rates of the reactions and the overpotentials of these reactions. Now for the case in place here, for the case of CO2 electro reduction, everything is kind of similar, but also a bit different. So on the anodic side, in principle, you have a similar process. So you have water and you break it into oxygen. On the cathodic side, however, things are a bit different. You have another ingredient into the cocktail. So you bring CO2 into the cocktail, and hopefully you do things smart enough, you could not only generate hydrogen, which was the thing that you were doing before, and actually maybe you don't want even to generate hydrogen, but you could generate a variety of hydrocarbons that are very interesting and very useful for a society. For example, you could generate mixtures of hydrogen and carbon monoxide, which is known as syngas, a very important combination of gases for the chemical industry and for the manufacturing. You could also use methanol synthesized in this way that could be plugged in existing supply chains. So it could be really transformative if you could generate renewable methanol in this way, but also more complex hydrocarbons with increasing number of carbons. For example, ethanol as a fuel, or butanol, which also uses fuels. And very importantly too, you could also generate ethylene. Ethylene is one of the most important feedstocks for the manufacturing industries, used to make plastics and many other materials too. Now you could make many things, but this means that you have to be careful with the metrics of these efficiencies, right? So I'll just briefly introduce some of the numbers that we will be talking about during this talk. Okay, so you could see here a substrate, the catalyst, you could see here CO2 molecules, and you could see here examples of different products in principle. So one very important figure of merit in these CO2 electrolysis systems is selectivity. And in particular, this is often referred to as Faradaic efficiency, which conveys the fraction of electrons that are used for a given molecule. So for example, if you have a 25 Faradaic efficiency towards methane, that means that 25% of your electrons are used to generate methane. Activity is, well, importantly, selectivity is very important because you want to be very selective towards a given product. Otherwise, separation costs when you scale these systems are huge and in some cases too high to be realistic. The activity of this reaction, that means how many molecules per second you generate, is one of the most important aspects too. In electrochemistry, this translates to current density. Okay, and considering the selectivity or Faradaic efficiency, the product of both, the product of current density and Faradaic efficiency is partial current density. The partial current density towards a given product tells you about the productivity. So you want to have a very high partial current density towards the product of interest, for example, ethylene. This impacts the productivity of your systems and the capital cost of your system. So if you have a high productivity, you can, the techno-economic analysis of this technology tells you that this could be profitable. Otherwise, it wouldn't. The energy efficiency, of course, is how many volts you put in the system to generate a given product. You want to be to save energy, so you want to be energy efficient. So this is cheap. So this impacts the operating costs. And overall, the stability, of course, you want everything to be stable. Now, I've seen you can make many different products. right? In this case, there are many different reaction pathways to get to these different products. Everything's very complicated. You have many different reaction intermediates. You have different coupling steps, different reaction pathways which compete with each other to get to different points. And not only this, also the thermodynamics of these reactions are at the same place. So the voltages that in principle will be required to transform CO2 into carbon monoxide, formic acid, methane, or ethylene are really within the same range. There's a strong competition in the thermodynamic domain, and there is a strong competition in the kinetic domain too. Now, there are different strategies to manipulate this catalyst and try to improve a given reaction. One of the most well-known strategies now is to control the way metals interact with the reactants, how metals interact with CO2 or with the subsequent reaction intermediates. In this example here, you can see how by alloying platinum and gold, for example, you could change the electronic properties of the alloy, and in doing so, change the binding energy of the metal to the molecules that you want to transform. In this case, the binding energy to CO. So if the binding energy to CO is very high, that means CO molecules want to stay in the substrates as catalytic sites are occupied and they cannot react. So most of the things that you can do then is only hydrogen. When you have a very little binding energy, the molecules live and non-couple with each other. So there is a trade-off always, right? So you want to have the right binding energy of the metal to the molecules that you want to interact. This is kind of similar to how a twister game would work. So you have people, these persons are molecules, which are trying to touch the different catalytic sites, and they have to do it in the right way. And in that way, what we do is to try to design this mat here, this twisted mat with different approaches. One of the things that is more or less understood now too is that the impact of metal is key. So for example, there are metals that are well known to generate hydrogen here. And this is mainly determined by their electronic properties. There are metals that are well known to generate carbon monoxide. For example, silver and gold are very well known to do that. But interestingly, there is only one well-known element able to generate multi-carbon products using electrochemistry. So carbon-carbon coupling, and this is copper. So far, copper has been the only element that has been shown to generate complex hydrocarbons such as ethanol or ethylene efficiently enough. And there are different theories why this happens, but nothing is so clear yet. So it's kind of under debate, but it depends on the electronic properties and on the facets and other things too. Just to showcase one of the early examples of efficient ethylene production, this is a paper from Beatriz Roldan from 2016. We learned also that not only the element matters, it also matters how do you make your catalyst. So it doesn't matter, it matters if you make your catalyst using nanoparticles or you oxidize your catalyst first or not. In this case, in this paper, they've shown that depending on the initial oxidation state of copper, you could achieve high Faradaic efficiency approaching 60% towards ethylene, whereas if you have a different precursor, so you just have a non-oxidized metal, just pure copper, your Faradaic efficiency cannot reach high numbers for ethylene and can only reach moderate numbers for methane. In this early example, this was demonstrated in an H-cell type of reactor. So all the catalysts were embedded in the electrolyte, and I'll show you why this is important. It's important because in part the current density that I forgot to add the units here, sorry. So this is the partial current density for ethylene here is only 7 milliamps per square centimeter. And this is kind of far from the numbers that you would need to achieve to be competitive at the techno-economic point. So in order for this process to be interesting, you would need to have currents on the order of hundreds of milliamps. So this is still far. Nevertheless, it's a good beginning. Now you can achieve selective ethylene generation. So in one of our early works in 2018, we just first changing the reactor type, so moving away from these aqueous type of reactors into a reactor called flow cell type of reactor, where the reagents are provided from the gas phase. So instead of dissolving CO2 in water, which has a limited solubility, you just flow CO2 through a gas diffusion layer. you can be much more efficient. And one reason that allows you to be more efficient is only because you are using this kind of flow cell reactors. You can change a lot the electrolytes. And now you can allow to use very alkaline media. And this changes a lot how this reaction proceeds. Well, we learned that if you move to very alkaline conditions, you can reduce a lot the overpotential. That means the volts that you need in order to produce ethylene. You could see here these violet lines, the Faraday efficiency for CO and for ethylene. For ethylene, it's kind of low. For 1 molar KOH electrolyte, and you see how by increasing the alkalinity, by increasing the amount, the molar concentration of KOH in the electrolyte up to 10 molar, you can see how dramatically you can increase and lower, not increase, but lower the overpotential needed to generate ethylene. And you can do that with high efficiencies, more or less, with the Faraday efficiencies up to 50%. Once we learned this, we then wanted to look at other aspects, at other figures of merit, such as productivity, such as current. And we learned that only a small region of this gas diffusion layer of this electrode was responsible for carrying out the CO2 reduction reaction. We learned that only the first tens of nanometers, around 10 to 20 nanometers of the catalyst, were doing the right reaction, the reaction we want, and the rest of the electrode was doing hydrogen evolution. So that means not sufficient CO2 was reaching catalytic sites in this case. You can see here how the Faraday efficiency for ethylene compares versus current density for different thicknesses. And you can see that the highest performance is achieved for 25 nanometers. And you can see how by increasing the thickness of the catalyst, by increasing the catalyst loading, which in principle would allow you to achieve high productivities, is actually decreasing performance. So that's why it's important to have a very abrupt catalyst in these reaction conditions. Now, these catalysts shown high performance, high Faraday efficiency, and high current, but they were not really stable. You can see how here these black circles here represent the Faraday efficiency for ethylene versus time. You can see how within the hour the performance is lost. So we thought, okay, what's wrong? And we figured out that controlling the hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity in these gas diffusion electrodes was crucial. So the way we were making electrodes before, we were just depositing copper on top of a carbon paper. And the reason why this didn't work is because hydrophobicity was lost and everything was flooded. And then all of these gas flow reaction conditions didn't work. It was as if you were just dipping your electrode, your catalyst in the aqueous kind of reactor. So we thought of, redesigning in such a way, redesigning the catalytic electrode in such a way that you change the roles of everything. So instead of having a conductive carbon paper in the bottom, which is responsible for charge transport and is responsible for hydrophobicity, we just put the best material for hydrophobicity. We just put a PTFE gas diffusion layer. We deposited the catalyst on the top, and then we just design the current collector on top. So this is a combination of carbon nanoparticles and graphite. And only when we inverted this kind of structure, we could achieve efficient and stable operation. So far we achieved stable operation. We have high Faraday efficiency for ethylene, and we have kind of high currents on the order of hundreds of milliamps, 150, 175 partial current density to ethylene, which is great, but it's not sufficient because we want to increase the productivity so that we can reduce the capital expenditures associated with this technology and make this technology viable. So we thought, okay, what if we modify the substrate of the catalyst in such a way we could make more CO2 available across the reaction interface? Just to remind you, in this case, we learned that only the first tens of nanometers are performing the reaction. So only 10 to 20 nanometers are useful. What if we could extend this reaction interface much into the catalyst? So we begin modeling what will happen if you just increase the availability of CO2, and by, for example, considering the diffusion coefficient of CO2 on top of the surface of the catalyst. You can see just by how increasing this number, you could increase the available current within the ampere regime, so by orders of magnitude. So to achieve this increase in CO2 availability, we looked into a very well-known polymer in the field of electrochemistry, that's naphthion. Naphthion pertains to a family of ionomers called perfluorinated sulfonic acid ionomers, which are characterized by having an ionic group of a sulfonic acid, which is hydrated and provides with water transport and ion transport, and then a combination of hydrophobic backbone domains and side chain domains. These polymers are polar. You have a polar group here and you have a non-polar group here. So we thought, okay, how can we deposit this on top of the copper carbon gas diffusion electrodes that you have seen in the previous slides? So we mix these polymers with some alcohols and water polar solvents in such a way we hope that we could play with the way these polymers will self-assemble when deposited in the final film. So we mix naphthion, we mix alcohols and water, we shake it, we put it in a spray gun, we spray on top of the surface of the gas diffusion electrodes, and you can see here this scan electron microscopy and TMs how the copper fibers here are covered kind of conformally with a very thin film of the polymer that we want to make, the ionomer of naphthion. You can see here a cross section at the TM where you can see the thickness of this polymer is around 10 to 15 nanometers. And then we said, okay, let's see what happens when we put this into the electrochemical cell. And instead of working with CO2 reduction, we went into a kind of simple reaction, a benchmark reaction, which is oxygen reduction reaction. And we carried out this reaction at 5 molar KOH and in alkaline conditions at different loadings. You can see here how the reference is a blue line, and you can see how by increasing the loading of the ionomer in microliters per square centimeter, you could see here how the limiting current density changes. So when you see a plateau here, that means that you don't have enough oxygen to be reduced. So for example, in the green case, you can see you start increasing the current density, so you are performing the reaction. At some point, this saturates. Okay, but what we see is that when we change the loading of the ionomer, we could just really change the limiting current, increase the limiting current, meaning that we are a priori increasing the availability of the reactant, which is oxygen in this case. And all of this happened, importantly, while the activity for hydrogen evolution reaction at higher potentials was still the same. So in principle, we suspected that the only thing that we were changing was the availability of the gas. We looked into Raman spectroscopy to try to understand how these ionomers assembled into the copper electrode. In Raman, is surface enhanced Raman spectroscopy, you can get really high resolution to the molecular fingerprints of these ionomers. And we are lucky because the substrate is a metal already, so you have CERS by default. So you could see here in this plot the Raman intensity versus wave number for the reference, the catalyst over PTFE. And you could see how everything changes once you add the ionomers. You have different peaks corresponding to the different vibrational modes of the different parts of the ionomer. So you have the CF and CC group, and you have the sulfonic acid group here. And the interesting thing here in this plot is to see how the relative amplitude of these two peaks, so the sulfonic acid and the other peak, change when you hydrate the sample. So once you immerse this in water, which is the operating condition of this electrode, there is a change in the relative amplitude of these two peaks, making the contribution of the sulfonic acid more prominent. And this hinted us to think, okay, that could mean that the functional group closer to the surface of the copper electrode is actually the sulfonic acid group, meaning that the copper catalyst has access to these ions and has access to water as well. When we actually implemented these electrodes into the reaction that we want to improve, we observed a dramatic increase in partial current density, in productivity. So you could see here for copper ionomer, without the ionomer, the partial current density saturates, the limiting current is around hundreds of milliamps, as we've seen in the previous example. But when we add the ionomer on top, you can see how you have a six-fold improvement in the partial current density for the CO2 reduced products, in this case, CO and ethylene. Okay, so having proven this performance enhancement on planar substrates, we thought, okay, how can we improve this even further? So we thought of designing a 3D kind of architecture where we combine copper nanoparticles on these ionomers in a structured way. So you can see here, this is a schematic showing copper nanoparticles mixed in a polymer matrix of this ionomer. So basically, we mix copper nanoparticles and ionomer. We spray coat this on top of the substrate, the PTFE copper substrate, and ended up having some kind of a percolation pathway of copper nanoparticles that serves to provide electrons, and a percolating pathway of the PFSA ionomer, which serves to provide with the increased local availability of the reactant, in this case, oxygen. You could see here in these other panels the ADX mapping of this. In blue, you could see the copper nanoparticles, and in green, you could see the corresponding mapping for carbon, which is the proxy for the ionomer. So okay, we then went to increase the catalyst loading on top of the substrates. If you remember, we were saying before that in earlier catalysts only the first tens of nanometers work, but in here, on the contrary, we could make the catalyst as thick as 15 microns and still see higher current, higher partial current density, achieving a plateau around 5 to 6 micrometers thickness, and achieving in this case a total productivity for carbon 2 products of more than 1 ampere per square centimeter. So then we went to optimize more things in the system, such as the exact electrolyte composition, the exact thickness, and we obtained an overall combination of figures of merit such as this. So the Faraday efficiency for ethylene was close to 70%. The total partial current density for ethylene was around 1213 amperes. So this is much higher than before. And the overall, so okay, the half cell energy efficiency for this reaction was around 45%. But when you measure the full cell reaction efficiency at 1 ampere, we were obtaining around 20% for the generation of ethylene. Now, so far we have seen how we could improve the generation of hydrocarbons in electrochemical systems, in particular the generation of ethylene from CO2. We obtain high Faraday efficiencies. We obtain very high productivities. We obtain kind of okay energy efficiencies, not so high, but okay. But there is a hidden problem here. So we did that by using very high alkaline medium. And this is good because this improves certain aspects of the CO2 reduction reaction, such as carbon-carbon coupling and CO2 activation. But it comes with a consequence. It turns out that the reaction where CO2 interacts with the hydroxyl groups that are present in this very alkaline media is downhill. So whenever you mix CO2 and hydroxyl groups, you end up having carbonate. So when you look at this approach at the system level, it turns out that if you want to recycle the electrolyte that would have turned into carbonate, you would use much more energy that you would need to just run the whole operation. So you are using more energy to recycle the electrolyte that has been consumed by converting CO2 into carbonate than the actual energy that you are using to convert CO2 into any molecule of your choice. And this is because we operate in very high alkaline conditions. So one approach to try to mitigate this problem is to move to more neutral conditions, such as instead of working with alkaline flow cells, work with membrane electrode assemblies, where you could use more kind of neutral analytes, more kind of neutral also catholites streamed through the system. But that's not enough even. You can see here how even in this case of neutral CO2 electro reduction, when you flow CO2 into the system, all the local hydroxyl groups that are generated at the surface of your catalyst react with CO2, creating carbonate that crosses across the membrane to the other side of the reactor and is mixed with with the generated oxygen. So you need also to separate CO2 and oxygen here, which introduces a lot of energy costs too. You could see here just how the energy intensity for different carbonate formation ratio compares. And you can see here the case of the alkaline flow electrolyzers that we shown before, and the case of neutral MEA. So in order to, overcome actually for good this carbonate formation problem, there are different strategies. One strategy is just, okay, to separate the reactions. We know CO2 reacts with hydroxyl groups. What about we do the CO2 reaction to another product, such as CO, in a system that does not have the requirement for high alkalinity? And this is the case of the solid oxide electrolyzer. For example, here, there are systems that, such as this, that operate at high temperatures and have very high Faraday efficiencies for CO. So you just have a first system where you generate CO, and then you could plug this CO into a second system, which could operate in alkaline conditions very well, and that wouldn't suffer from this kind of carbonate generation problem. A second strategy that's also interesting is to move away from alkaline completely. So what about if you could perform the CO2 reduction reaction in an acidic electrolyzer in such a way that all the CO2 that you enter in the system could be transformed directly into the product of interest, and any probable molecule of CO2 that was converted into carbonate based on the local generation of hydroxyl groups that happens normally when you have a reducing cathode would be down converted to CO2 by the presence of a lot of protons around, because your electrolyte is very, very acidic. Okay, so we went into the lab and we looked into this. So we monitored the pH and the gas percentage at the anode side of the reactor. If you remember, the problem was that CO2 was converted into carbonate, was crossing the electrode, sorry, was crossing the membrane, and was then converted back into CO2, wasting energy. You see here that when we operate the system in a phosphate buffer electrolyte with a pH around 1, there is almost none CO2 detected at the anode side. So there is no crossover, which means that CO2 is not converted into carbonate in the first place. And you can see also that most of the gas that we have is 100% unity is oxygen. So this system seems very promising. Okay, we have zero crossover. We have in principle lower system resistance because the system is very acidic, and we have in principle too a lower anodic cover potential based on the existing field of knowledge, body of knowledge for PM electrolyzers. But there is a problem though, of course. In these acidic conditions, you have so many protons around that hydrogen evolution dominates the cathodic reaction. So you can barely do anything but hydrogen if you are operating in a very low pH. No carbon dioxide reduction occurs near pH 1. So we then thought, okay, what's going on? How can we circumvent this problem? And we did some modeling, and we found that the surface pH of the catalyst changes a lot with, I mean, depending on the operating current. And this is known. There are many other papers that have shown this. That when you operate the system in very high current densities, you generate a lot of local hydroxyl groups, and this increases the pH in the surface. So we found that when the currents are above 200 milliamps per square centimeter, more or less, the surface pH, even when the bulk pH is around 1, approaches neutrality. And this is a regime where you start getting the protons not from hydronium groups, but from water itself. So it's kind of in the threshold where the kinetic competition to generate hydrogen or to generate CO2 could be somewhere where CO2 reduction could win. So you don't have so many protons that you can only make hydrogen. You have to get these protons from water too. But unluckily, at these conditions, even nothing happens. So even if you operate a higher current density, you can barely do anything but hydrogen. So, okay, we thought, based on the literature too, recently many groups have been studying the role of cations in this CO2 reaction. So we thought, okay, let's play with the cations in the system. So you have, in this case, when we have the bare 1 molar phosphate buffer electrolyte with around 1 pH, you see that when we change the stream of nitrogen to CO2, so we start providing CO2 at this point in the system, and for a fixed current density, nothing happens. So we don't have CO2 reduction. We mostly have hydrogen. Okay, and I'm afraid you cannot see the right axis here, but okay, the point of this plot is that when we add some potassium into the system, so we add some potassium cations into the system, there is something very funny happening. So the partial current density for hydrogen, which is this square red colored points, decreases, and conversely, the partial current density for CO2 reduction increases in the same amount. interestingly, without changing the overall potential. So that means that when you have cations into the system and you have CO2, CO2 is getting reduced. Okay. Just to study this more broadly, we change the amount of cations into the system for a given buffer solution and for a given current density. In this case, for 400 milliamps per square centimeter. Importantly, if we did this at lower current densities, not at 400, but at 200 or 100, in the regime where we were still taking the ions for from hydronium, this effect was not so prominent. So only when you operate at high current density sufficient that the surface pH is above a certain threshold, this cation effect is prominent. So you can see here, we start adding some potassium in the system, and we can then start identifying some methane, some carbon dioxide, and even some ethylene as we increase the amount of potassium. So now, having found the role of potassium in the system, the key role of potassium, we thought of, okay, let's redesign the catalyst again in such a way we could improve the local availability of the potassium ions in the system. So we thought then of combining again the copper metallic catalyst with these kind of ionomers of the family of the perfluorinated sulfonic acid ionomer, not in this case naphthalene, but a shorter ionomer which has little different properties, in such a way that this ionomer would preferentially exchange its hydrated domains with potassium and not with protons. So the local population of potassium ions at the surface of copper would be much higher than otherwise, because the solubility of potassium ions would be limited in water. You have like kind of a solid environment where potassium is more available. You can see in this way how, by using this kind of new catalyst and screening the current densities, we can be more productive and we can generate, just focusing this one, for example, in this regime, we could generate CO, we could generate an amount of ethylene around 20%, around 1 ampere, and even we could see some propane. But what's more important about this work is not only the Faraday efficiency or the current, is the carbon efficiency. So in all the previous works that I have been showing you, which are these ones at the bottom, the carbon efficiency was very low. That means most of the carbon that you put in the system, most of the CO2 that you put in the system, instead of being converted into the product of your choice, in this case ethylene, was transformed into carbonate. So the efficiency, the carbon efficiency was under 10%, and this impacted a lot, you think, at the system level, the energy that would be required and to regenerate electrolyte. In this work, if you count at the outlet stream of your electrolyzer, the number of molecules that you generate and divided by the number of moles of CO2 that you put in the system, you get a number around 70%, which is above the theoretical limit for neutral media for CO2 electro reduction, both for CO and for ethylene. So this is kind of the first demonstration of efficient CO2 reduction in acidic media, and as a consequence, efficient carbon efficient use of CO2, so high carbon efficiency. And again, this is in line. The importance of cations is something that we, the community, are still have a lot to learn from. There are several works, several recent works. One from Nuria with copper, and when they show that potassium, or in general the cations, are crucial to enable CO2 electro reduction. So they are the ultimate responsible for activating CO2 molecules. In the absence of these metallic cations, nothing happens. And also a recent paper from the group of Janaki, where they provided the cations from the anodic side. So instead of putting these metallic salts in the cathode, they just mix this in the anode, and it was found that these salts cross over the membrane and still do some magic tricks in the cathode to enable efficient CO2 electro reduction. And just to conclude, this is kind of summarizing the state of the art for CO2 electro reduction into multi-carbon products, in particular into ethanol and into ethylene. You could see at the different colors how the Faraday efficiency compares in the case of ethanol and ethylene to the target performance that would make this technology viable, considering the cost of the system, considering the value of the product that you generate, and considering the cost of electricity, and compare also to already more mature technologies such as PEM electrolyzers, which are very well known to make hydrogen right now. You can see how the Faraday efficiency for ethylene is close to the target. And in this red bar, you can see the Faraday efficiency in the case of acidic, so in the case of high carbon efficiency. So these yellow lines correspond to the case when we were really bad in carbon dioxide. So when we improved carbon utilization, everything went down. So there is still a lot of room to improve here. There is also a lot of room to improve here in the productivity. So we have seen today how in alkaline conditions, the productivity was very high, even above the required threshold. But when you move to systems that do not suffer from carbonate formation, the productivity that we achieved so far is still far, midway towards the final goal for techno-economic viability. The energy efficiency, in any case, is still low. So for both cases, the energy efficiency at the system level, at the electrolyzer level, is around 20%, whereas the ideal target for a viable operation is still far. It's still 60%. And there's still lots of things to do on the cathodic side to improve CO2 reduction, but there is also other things to do on the anodic side. So far, if you remember the picture when I was showing you the electrolyzer, I mentioned that water is split and is used to generate, is oxidized to generate oxygen. But oxygen has little to no value, at least in this world, unless you were in Mars, for example. So why not using another kind of oxidative reactions that could add value? So we could, for example, generate epoxides for ethylene. You could make other kind of values that not only reduce the energy input that you require, but would increase even quite substantially the value of the products that you generate. One thing we're still far from the goal is lifetime. So far, operation has been shown to be efficient up to hundreds of hours, but the target, for an ideal industrial process is on the order of thousands of tens of thousands of hours. Just to conclude again, this is one example I wanted to highlight here. So this work happened in Toronto when corresponding to one of the first papers I've shown you that we published in 2018. We also enrolled into the Carbon X Prize, and in this prize we were challenged to transform 1 ton per day of CO2. So when we were in the lab, these kind of reactors are able to transform quantities on the order of milligrams to grams of CO2 per day. So we were hard, and we had a team that increased the productivity of this, increased the scale of this from milligrams to grams to kilograms, and finally, in the final of this prize, 200 kilograms per day of CO2. So there are ongoing efforts in scale up of this technology, not from the CERT team in Toronto, but also from other companies here in Europe. In particular, Siemens too is doing a great job in scaling up this CO2 electro reduction technology. In their case, to generate carbon monoxide. And this to conclude now, I would like to thank most of my colleagues at U of T that were involved or were actually the main responsibles of this work. I'd like to thank also BIS, all the funders. I'd like to thank you all too. I'd like to draw your attention to this very nice QR code that will lead you to a very nice website with very nice job postings for master's and PhD students interested in many fields across chemistry, physics, engineering, coding, robotics. And this is my email address in case you have any question. And I'm happy to answer any question here too. But anyways, thank you much. Thank you so much for your time.
Very much for this wonderful presentation. Now the floor is open for questions, maybe. Someone around? Yeah, JR. Michael.
Thank you, Pelayo, for a wonderful talk, really interesting. I would have many questions, but I would like to ask you about something that I have been discussing with many colleagues. For example, in most of your experiments, you combine a ionomer with an electrolyte, for example, in the high alkaline pH. But the pH of your bulk solution is 5 molar KOH, but the ionomer is acidic. So how is this changing the pH of working on in your last example? Your model tells us that at high current densities, the surface pH is different. Which pH do you use to estimate the thermodynamic potential of the reaction? How can you do that?
Okay. So that's a good question, actually. And then the answer is that it's very difficult to measure the actual local pH of the surface. So that's why when we report performance here, we don't even measure the pH of the surface. So we don't correct, so we don't have free electron systems. We don't need to know the pH. So in these membrane electrode assemblies, you have the full potential. You just measure the potential across the anode and the cathode, and that's the energy efficiency that we report. If you were, of course, thinking of potentials versus reversible hydrogen electrode or other kind of electrodes, that's very important. And in the works where the system was performing in alkaline conditions, we were using the high pH that happens in this case, because actually in that case the bulk pH was similar to the pH that the models estimate for these operating conditions. But you're right, in this more acidic realm, it's kind of challenging, so it's difficult to know the local pH.
Questions?
Okay, thank you so much for this very, very brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question is on the cation effect, because if I understood properly, you say that like at low, well, not that low actually, but like lower than a threshold of current density, such cation effect was not that prominent. So the question is like, so could you see CO2 reduction without cation and such low current density? And in case you could see, then like, what should be the triggering effect? Like then is the proton source that varies from proton to water, or because I'm really like, this result is very nice. I was really a bit like surprised about the result at low current density.
So at low current densities, all the cyclic voltammetry with nitrogen or CO2 overlaps. We didn't necessarily see a lot of CO2 reduced products at the low current density. So it's really the case that only when you just change your proton source from hydronium to water, when this effect is more prominent. But I think this is still deserves more studies, because it's kind of, surprising, and it's kind of, more things might be going on in this regime, and that were not considered here. So, but for this case, yes.
Any more questions from the audience here? Yeah, Julio.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. I'm wondering about these potential decomposition processes that you have on your catalyst. Could you tell us a little bit what do you think is happening? Do you have some information?
So yeah, let me see if I got the question right. So you're asking about the decomposition processes of
the catalyst. I mean, this is one of the key issues. You are working with some heterogeneous systems, and they last for 100, 300 hours. But why they, what happens with them?
Yeah.
Do you know?
So what we suspect so far, and what we see actually, and we learn a lot during this scale-up of the technology actually, was that neutral and alkaline systems, one of the main reasons for loss of performance is the local formation of salts. So you start getting a lot of carbonates on top of the catalyst surface, thereby reducing the surface of the catalyst, also increasing the distance to the membrane, and this starts being complicated. At some point, you might also have some leaching too of copper in case it was not under reducing conditions. So if copper is not under negative conditions, it just oxidizes and gets dissolved and is lost. And beyond the salt formation, one very important aspect is the loss of hydrophobicity. So when the electrode loses the hydrophobicity, this complex interplay between the gas phase and the water electrolyte changes in such a way the water flutes the gas diffusion electrode, and CO2 stops being available for reaction. And this is something that still has to be solved, especially when your electrodes are very large. Because when your electrodes are large, you also have to think of thermal management, you have to think of many other things. And one interesting question ensuing your question is if this will be so important in acidic conditions, or actually if in acidic conditions you'll have many other challenges because things are more complicated too.
Thank you very much. Then the second thing I have is about you start to spread your electron, become 3D, of microns. How you ensure that the current arrive to every specific site? So because they were showing, it is what clear to me, but probably you have some about that.
Okay, that's a good question. I think this is also something that's not been fully explored yet. So this structure was optimized for thousands of hours. So we optimized the loading of copper nanoparticles. We optimized the amount of nephron. We optimized also the solvents. So apparently too, like when you use one solvent or the other, the way this composite dries is very important. So depending on the ratio of components, depending on the way you spray coat them, and the thickness too, and the way they self-assemble in the last case, everything is different. So only for a very particular narrow window, you could achieve high performance. And you are right, like even in this case, most likely most of I mean, there will be a high fraction of copper nanoparticles which will not be connected, but most likely this will be oxidized and dissolved, and I don't know. We still don't know because it's very difficult actually to characterize these materials during reaction.
Any more questions from the audience here? Otherwise, we will try to leave the floor for, I mean, I have many, but I would like to take the questions from the room. So Judith?
Yeah, Nuria, we have a couple of questions. Then, if you don't mind, I will try to unmute the microphone of the first person. So, Fergal O'Connor, please unmute yourself and you can make your own question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Just to clarify, is the source of this carbon dioxide the atmosphere?
Sorry, first I didn't get your name, and then second, the question was if this carbon dioxide is from the atmosphere?
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question as well. My name is Fergal O'Connor, thanks.
Thank you for your question. So, yeah, I didn't mention this here, but the carbon dioxide used for these experiments is just purified carbon dioxide. We buy carbon dioxide tanks and we plug these into the electrolyzers. Transforming carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere or from dilute streams from single point sources is actually very challenging. So that's
okay. Thank you.
And then we have another question from Tamal Chatterjee. So please, Tamal, unmute your microphone.
Okay, thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah.
So my question is that you have investigated the role of potassium, but of course, can you do same kind of investigation with dications like calcium, like the group 2 metal ions? Or have you done this kind of a study and check their activities under that phosphate and that particular pH condition?
okay. So, Tamal, for your question, if I understood right, you're asking if the choice of cation is also important. So
yes,
calcium and others. So yeah, I think it's important, of course, and there are several studies showing that bigger cations, for example, cesium, are better or more active to activate or to enable more efficient CO2 electro reduction.
yes.
In this case, we have some preliminary results, but I think, again, as I mentioned before, these still could deserve further studies. What we have seen here is the cations have effect, but interestingly, all anions have similar to none effect.
Okay, so what I understood is yet to explode or is under investigation, something like that.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So it's yet to explode or something under investigation, the role.
Yeah, there is an effect, of course.
Okay, okay, thank you.
And there are no more questions here at Zoom. And oh yeah, I have here another one from Alba Zurita. So I'll try to activate the microphone to Alba. Please, Alba, go ahead. You have to unmute your microphone, Alba, by yourself.
Okay, now?
Now, yes, thanks.
Okay. Hi, I've got a question derived from what my classmate asked about the carbon dioxide. You said that the carbon dioxide you use now is mainly pure. So if you are trying to scale this system up, and as you said, there are other compounds that may cause interferences. So which are the current trends to try to avoid these interferences?
Okay, that's a great question. A very loud one here. Okay, so if you were to just to think of more realistic sources, so you think, for example, of carbon dioxide capture from the atmosphere, the way the process works, you will end up having kind of pure carbon dioxide pool. So where the challenge is, you wanted to transform carbon dioxide from dilute streams, for example, from the exhaust of your car or from a pipeline or from a pipe of an industry. The main challenge there is the presence of oxygen, which is reduced at lower potentials or easily than carbon dioxide. So you will use a lot of your electricity just to transform oxygen into water, for example. And another challenge too is the presence of contaminants such as sulfates or nitrates, which might interfere or might kind of poison the surface of the catalysts.
And one, well, to avoid this, are you considering a multi-stage process, or how do you think you can deal with this?
I don't have a, there are many ways working on this. You think, for example, of using some kind of filter, using MOF, or using, I don't know, catalysts that, for example, are not very selective, not very efficient for the reactions that you want to suppress. In this case, oxygen reduction. So this is a fascinating field, actually, and I don't have a single answer for you. But yes, in general, there are many things one could do there.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you. So, yeah, I will keep the final question. What is beyond copper? But
Sure.
It's anything beyond copper that we can use?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, depends what you want to do. Apparently, you're right. Like, it seems so far for electrochemistry, copper is the only element that has been shown to be working for carbon-carbon coupling. It would be nice if someone discovered some other new material that allowed us to avoid using copper, because copper has its own problems of ion diffusivity and stability. From a systems perspective, I think there might be something beyond copper if you think of tandem reactors. So if you decouple different steps, or you incorporate also temperature or others into the system, you might not need copper, and you can achieve carbon-carbon coupling through thermal processes or others. So, I don't know. Yeah.
So there is plenty of things to do, huh?
Yeah, there is always plenty of things to do.
This will keep us busy for a little bit of time. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Pelayo, for coming and for giving this wonderful lecture. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you, the people that has been over the Zoom. Thank you.